I now have the great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Ekaterina Degot, and her Manifesto of Inferiority Complex. Ekaterina is an art historian, an art critic and curator based in Moscow. She has worked as a senior curator at the State Tretyakov Gallery, as an art columnist at Kommersant Daily, and is now chief editor of www.openspace.ru/art. She has taught in many schools and is at the moment professor at various American and European universities, as well as teacher at Moscow's Alexander Rodchenko Photography School. Please join me in welcoming Ekaterina Degot.
Hello. So my manifesto has another title yet, the Critical Manifesto of Über-Contemporary Art. The true reason I gave to my manifesto the title of Manifesto of Inferiority Complex is that I was really frustrated of finding oneself hardly able to write any decent manifesto at all. Too bad for me, since nowadays, as everybody knows, anyone is supposed to have at least one manifesto at hand. A very individual definition of oneself, one's own desire and plans. A manifesto is a spectacle of our ego. It matters more than an opinion, and certainly more than an experience and knowledge. This is due to the disappearance of the authority of academic research, of course, in favor of management and media activity. This is on my space, of course, we're supposed to present our manifestos. We're supposed to know, love, and manifest ourselves more than we're supposed to know, question, and study the world around us in space or time. One of the reasons I discovered behind my difficulties with manifestos was that even if I do belong to the caste of busy curators, I didn't actually root the survivals of the profession of a critic from my own mind. This manifesto could also be called a manifesto of a critic, a critical manifesto. And critics are very good at inferiority complexes, I'm sure many of us know, and psychoanalysts even refuse to treat them. Critical spirit doesn't help much in producing manifestos. The feeling of your own or someone else's bottle being half empty rather than half full poisons your voice, and you stop being convincing. You cannot be sure of your own manifesto. Criticism actually does not necessarily have to be convincing. When it is good, it is rather contagious. It may raise questions rather than answer them, and this is okay. This may even be practical in terms of a panel discussion, for example. The more critical you are, the more questions you get. And when I asked myself, in the first place, what is the difference between the manifesto and the normal panel discussion talk, is that I discovered that after a manifesto, you're not really supposed to ask me any questions. And also, I'm not supposed to thank anyone. It's like on a concert. Let's imagine a singer who, before singing something, would thank a theater director for inviting her, and after having produced a song, would ask the audience for questions. It's not been usually done in theater and concert. It's not been usually done after manifestos. A good manifesto blocks conversation, I would say. By the way, Kazimir Malevich was not aiming at art which would raise questions or produce long academic texts, as we may think, looking at his posthumous career. Malevich said that he would like to witness a prophet's words, how a prophet's words would stand still on his lips because of his, Malevich's, art. Early avant-garde manifestos like those of futurists or surrealists could include historical and social landmarks as something artists were supposed to refute and disclaim, like contemporary bourgeois lifestyle, for example. This was self-determination through a no. And this is sometimes our idea of manifestos. The manifesto is something negative. But very early, a different approach was adopted, the self-definition through a yes. In 1913, the Yes Manifesto by Russian artists Mikhail Larionov and Ilya Zdanevich was written, where both artists were answering yes to any journalist's political or aesthetical question, like, are you for conservative party? Yes. Or are you against the conservative party? Yes. These incompatible positive answers, these contradictory da da, which is yes in Russian, which later appeared as da-da, invented by Tristan Tzara, who was Romanian. In Romanian, da is yes, like in Russian. This collage of affirmations produced real destabilization and loss of orientation, which any productive manifesto has to offer. Or let's take Andy Warhol's famous "So What?", one of the most convincing manifestos of any time. This unmotivated assertion, this self-sufficiency, which annihilates any kind of comparisons with any context and history as such, is what is being in demand today, and what lies at the core of MySpace, YouTube, and actually Damien Hirst's arts as other forms of manifesto self-branding. And this excludes inferiority complex as something which is by definition based on comparisons. Russian avant-garde artists were saying, throw Pushkin from the ship of contemporary art, but to say that you have to know who Pushkin is and to compare yourself with him. This is not sometimes the case with contemporary art. This creates a new kind of art, which I would call uber-contemporary, the kind of contemporary culture that has finally cut through the umbilical cord that connects it to history. We no longer need the symbols of modernity that the avant-garde suggested. We have no need for monumental proof of historical changes, nor do we need disruption with the past. We have TV, advertising, and design, which do not just compete with art or make it redundant, but suggest that it continue on different ground in another context. This context is the physical moment. Any advanced artist no longer really needs the critic to write about him, because the critic contextualizes, makes differences, historicizes, but there is no more need of that. Artists are leaving the context of history and entering the context of media, newspapers, showbiz, and magazines. On TV, in glossy magazines, movies, and comics, we know that the pressure to innovate has been lifted completely, since the audience has a short memory. As someone running a successful internet site, I can tell you that some magazines and news sites republish material after a certain time simply because the reader will probably have changed or had forgotten. This art doesn't take place in history, but now and there, now and here, it becomes truly contemporary. It doesn't and will not have history, theory, criticism, university, and museums, but it does and will have newspapers, television programs, internet chats, self-learning, video installation corners in consumer electronic shops, I'm sure it will come very soon, local fan clubs, and advertisement on lampposts, and actually manifesto marathons. This new uber-contemporary art will not sell itself, but will be distributed through different channels, which might sometimes be free, as long as the same brand will produce luxury versions of the same. It will keep the consumer reaction in mind and include them, like internet does, that's really grasping collectivity. It will no longer be recognizable as modernism or even art, and will have a totally different institutional structure and different system of authorship. In the end, when Baudelaire called Constantin Guise the first artist of modern life, who did little more than to draw illustration of dresses for fashion magazines, he may have had this kind of art in mind. For contemporary art, I would say even traditional contemporary art, which traces its roots to classical modernism, it is difficult to blend with such a culture because it is by definition of a very undemocratic nature. Traditional contemporary art is based on comparison. Of all spheres of our life, it is one of the only fields, the other being fundamental research, that is allowed to be undemocratic. Withstanding the masses is part of its identity, and a very abnormal, actually, kind of market we all are more or less aware of is one of the instruments which sustains it. Through the entire 20th century, modernism was an art form that no one liked. In fact, this was one of its distinctive features. Consequently, whoever liked modernism could think on themselves as nobody, which actually makes life a lot easier, much easier than to have to produce a manifesto. This is why many serious authors have accused modernism of holding ordinary people in contempt, ignoring their values and joys. Modernism also had a certain inner answer to such accusation. The ordinary people actually collaborates with capitalism. Consequently, he deserves punishment. In the end, it is precisely this kind of punishment that modernism was to effect. Its artworks attempted to create intentionally unlikable products, damaged goods, painting impossible to savor, or pissoir impossible to piss in, or even hostile commodities that would harm the owners immediately or over time, like deteriorating fruit, which is now seems to be fashionable, an object containing a bump on a time fused. I think this is in fact a common avant-garde dream. Modernism is always tinged with a hue of sadism. It wants to deprive people pleasure, or just to separate them from consumption, waking the artist in them and fostering his development, as Lenin put it. But today, the sadism of depriving the spectator of pleasure proved capable of establishing a loyal following, actually. All over the world, the audience of contemporary art is basically composed of people who are accustomed to reacting to one and the same set of stimuli, or laugh at the same kind of joke, and then thankfully settle back in their routine. The art world is actually a very good sadomaso club, if we take artists and collectors who enjoyed actually being treated this way. In recent years, however, this mechanism has gone rusty and is less infallible. Its proponents have grown fewer in number, while one, if not several generations, have grown up finding pleasure in other games and another type of humor. But because of this club sensibility, critics do not really usually criticize. They know that one hand washes the other, that they are working for a common cause. The critic is only a critic in the Kantian sense. He has not been criticizing professionally since the early 20th century. In the art world, it is hardly customary for the artist who is critical himself to hear that his newest painting is worse than his last. It's not usually being said that one set of brown stripes in a Rothko painting is not as strong as another set of brown stripes and a Rothko painting nearby. Or we can take Thomas Hirschhorn installation. Critics do not usually go in these details. They hardly criticize, they explain, comment. This becomes especially apparent in comparison to film and theater criticism, which still lauds or berates directors and actors and offers its readership advice on which premieres to visit, seeming precisely this critical function as its calling. One generally assumes that this is because neither film nor theater are as advanced as art, where the audience reaction can already be safely ignored, since the number of visitors at an exhibition bears no direct relation on sales. Usually the state of affairs is to the artist's liking. One could say that the art world is sitting pretty. But then this uber-contemporary artist comes, then the one who sees the fame of a Steven Spielberg, let's say, as something seriously worth fighting for. And this artist is ready to part with his or her, but mostly his, psychological security in doing so. Because after all, film critics will generally throw annihilating mockery in Spielberg's direction, implying how sick we all are of him, but they will do so on the front page. Basically, one could write about Damien Hirst objects that finally the Marx Brothers were funnier, and Caipirinha is better still. And that would be a real triumph for contemporary art. Art would finally attain the status of Hollywood movies. It would lead the territory of its invulnerability, that its immortality. It would join the masses that die. So it turns out that this is how the death of art will happen. There is a huge irony in the fact that 20th century art has been talking about emptiness, nothingness, and the death of art for so long. But now this dissolution is taking place in a form completely unlike the one that avant-garde artists they dreamed of. The end has not come in the form of a black square on a white background, nor has it emerged as a smoothly painted surface, nor even as a cleaned urinal turned upside down, just as abstracted from everyday life as the black square. Basically, art has not died in the laconic form of absence, but as a horrible superabundance of images, brands, diamonds, and trademarks. abstraction and generalization have died out entirely, so that even fashion magazines now no longer tell us about tendencies and trends, but about which concrete handbag have been made by which concrete designer and is a must-have in this season. The aesthetics of the 90s sank on the ethical and poetic principle of both one and the other, a principle of manifold possibilities, of serendipity, with which it wanted to oppose the brutal modernist either-or. In practice, the romantic attitude of further and further had flowed into the consumerist more and more, which Baudrillard has called too much of too much. In fact, this is what we call the world of globalism, a world in which everything is included. But this means sadism of contemporary art has even become more effective. Only now, this uber-contemporary art has become torture through consumption and not through the inaccessibility of consumption. Torture through never-ending pleasure, unrelenting digestion, total excess, and continuous erection. This is the sadism of our time, in which nothing has been replaced by an excruciating everything. Since the world of ours is based not on restrictions, but on permissions. This is a world where ice cream and chocolate bar are considered basic food and salt in school vending machines, and fasting is a luxury. A world where we pay more and more to have less and less, like T-shirts without a Mickey Mouse, for example, or a bar without loud music. This uber-contemporary art is torturing the viewer not with inferiority complex of being not intelligent enough, rather with deep existential suffering of not being creating enough, not having one's own manifesto at hand, and not making money right out of it right away. But then again, it might change very soon. Even if manifestos never burn, as opposed to critical essays, I reserve to myself a right to withdraw this manifesto. So this would be a kind of temporary manifesto of our contemporary situation. Thanks.